She didn't think I noticed when she slipped something into my wine glass, but years of watching her subtle manipulations had taught me to never take my eyes off Eleanor when we were in the same room. My name is Meredith Chin, and for 7 years I've been married to her only son, the golden boy she never thought any woman would be good enough for. The tension at the Chin family dinner table was suffocating, as it always was. Eleanor sat at one end, spine perfectly straight, not a single silver hair out of place, her Chanel dress impeccably pressed. Richard, her husband of 40 years, sat at the opposite end, his attention focused on his plate as if the roasted duck was the most fascinating thing he'd encountered all day. It was a familiar tableau, Eleanor ruling over her domain while everyone else walked on eggshells. I first met David during my surgical residency at Boston Memorial Hospital. Those days were a blur of 30-hour shifts, terrible cafeteria coffee, and the constant, gnawing fear that a single mistake could cost someone their life. I was on my 3rd consecutive day without proper sleep when the hospital administration called an emergency budget meeting. They want to cut trauma resources by 15%, my attending physician had said, tossing the memo onto our break room table. Someone needs to fight this. The other residents looked away, unwilling to step into that particular battle. But I'd lost a patient the week before, a teenage boy who might have survived if we'd had an additional trauma bay available. I grabbed the memo and marched down to the administration office, still wearing scrubs stained with another patient's blood. The waiting area was sleek, all clean lines and modern furniture that no one actually seemed comfortable sitting in. The receptionist eyed me warily, taking in my disheveled appearance. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "No, but I need to speak with whoever made this decision," I replied, waving the budget memo. "It's urgent. I'm afraid Mr. Chan is in meetings all day." "It's all right, Diane," a voice interrupted. A man stepped out from a nearby office, tall, with kind eyes that somehow managed to look both tired and alert. "I'm David Chun. What seems to be the problem, Doctor?" "Wilson. Dr. Meredith Wilson," I said. "And the problem is that someone who's clearly never worked in a trauma unit has decided we can function with 15% fewer resources." David Chun didn't dismiss me or make excuses. Instead, he said something that would ultimately change both our lives. "Maybe you should come in and explain why that's a mistake." For 2 hours, I walked him through the realities of the trauma department, not with administrative spreadsheets but with real patient stories. I showed him my surgical schedule, the triage protocols, the impossible decisions we made daily because we were already stretched too thin. When I finally stopped talking, he was silent for a long moment. "Then, you're right," he said simply. "I'll revise the budget proposal." "Just like that?" I asked, suspicious. "Just like that," he confirmed with a slight smile. "Contrary to popular belief, Dr. Wilson, not all administrators are heartless bureaucrats. Some of us actually want the hospital to function properly." I left his office with the budget intact and a strange flutter in my chest that I initially attributed to victory. It was only when he appeared in the trauma unit 3 days later, ostensibly for a follow-up evaluation, but ultimately asking if I'd join him for coffee, that I recognized the flutter for what it was. Our courtship was swift but not reckless. We were both methodical people accustomed to evaluating situations and making decisions based on available evidence. After 6 months of dating, the evidence was clear. We worked well together, challenged each other intellectually, and had created a partnership that felt equal and supportive. When he proposed a year later, my yes was without hesitation. It was only after the engagement that David first mentioned his mother. "She can be traditional," he'd said carefully as we drove toward Brookline. "Family is everything to her." "That doesn't sound so bad," I'd replied naively. Eleanor Chen's home was exactly what I'd expected from David's descriptions. A stately colonial with perfectly manicured gardens and an interior that looked like it had been lifted from Architectural Digest. What I hadn't expected was the immediate, though expertly concealed, hostility that greeted me. A surgeon, Eleanor had said during that first dinner, her eyebrows slightly raised, teacup poised halfway to her lips. What a demanding career choice. I imagine you'll reconsider once you have children. Not if, but when. And not adjust, but reconsider as in abandon completely. I had smiled politely, holding her gaze. Actually, I find surgery incredibly fulfilling. I can't imagine giving it up for anything. The slight tightening around her eyes was nearly imperceptible, but I caught it. War had been silently declared. Later that night, as we drove home, David seemed relieved. That went well, don't you think? Mom seemed to like you. I glanced at him, wondering if we'd attended the same dinner. David, your mother spent the entire evening implying that my career is incompatible with being a good wife and mother. He looked genuinely surprised. What? No, she was just making conversation. Mom's always been supportive of my career. Your career, I emphasized. Not mine. David shook his head. You're misinterpreting. Mom is old-fashioned in some ways, but she's not against women working. She worked as a teacher before I was born. And then she gave it up to be a full-time mother and wife, I pointed out. Because that's what she wanted, David insisted. You're being unfair, Meredith. Give her a chance. I tried. God knows, I tried. Through the wedding planning, where Eleanor somehow managed to override every decision I made while making it seem like she was just offering helpful suggestions. Through the early years of our marriage, when she would call David constantly with emergencies that always seemed to occur when we had planned time together. Through the pregnancy with Lily, when her advice intensified to near harassment levels. You're still performing surgeries? At 6 months pregnant, she'd asked during a Sunday brunch, her voice pitched loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. Is that safe? Perfectly safe, I'd replied evenly. My OBGYN has no concerns. Well, Eleanor had sniffed. When I was pregnant with David, doctors advised complete rest during the final trimester. But I suppose medical standards have changed. Hopefully not for the worse. David had changed the subject then, always the peacemaker. Later he'd say, Mom's just concerned, Mare. Her pregnancy with me was difficult, and she nearly lost me in the 3rd trimester. That's where her worry comes from. Always an excuse. Always a justification. Always a reason why I should be understanding of Eleanor's concerns, while she never extended the same courtesy to me. When Lily was born, perfect, beautiful Lily with David's eyes and my stubborn chin, Eleanor had arrived at the hospital with an overnight bag. I'll stay with you for the first few weeks to help, she'd announced. Not offered. Announced. It was the first time I saw David truly stand up to his mother. Mom, we've already discussed this. Meredith's mother is coming to stay with us for the first week, and then we want some time, just the 3 of us. Eleanor's face had crumpled into an expression of such wounded betrayal that for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost? I see, she'd said quietly. I'm not needed then. The guilt trip worked on David, of course. By the time Lily was 2 weeks old, Eleanor was installed in our guest room just for a few days that stretched into 3 weeks of constant criticism disguised as helpful advice. Lily seems fussy. Perhaps your milk doesn't have enough nutrients? I gave David formula after the first month and he thrived. Should you be picking her up every time she cries? In my day, we let babies self-soothe. David's schedule is so busy. How do you manage with your career? I always made sure Richard came home to a proper dinner and a peaceful house. By the time she finally left, I was on the verge of postpartum depression, doubting every maternal instinct I had. It took months of therapy for me to regain my confidence as both a mother and a surgeon. Over the next 5 years, a pattern emerged. Eleanor would undermine me in subtle ways, David would insist I was overreacting, and I would second-guess myself until the next incident proved I wasn't imagining things. When I received the offer for Chief of Trauma Surgery, the youngest in the hospital's history, it felt like vindication. Not just professionally, but personally. Proof that I could be both an accomplished surgeon and a devoted mother and wife. Which brings us to that fateful dinner, the one where Eleanor finally showed her true colors in a way even David couldn't deny. The monthly family dinner at Eleanor and Richard's house was a Chin tradition I'd come to dread. Usually, I could claim a hospital emergency, but I'd already used that excuse twice in a row. David had given me that look this morning, the one that said, "Please, just try for me," and I'd reluctantly agreed to attend. Lily, now 5, had been excited to see her grandmother bouncing in her car seat the entire drive. Grammy said she got me something special, she chirped, while I exchanged a glance with David. Another extravagant gift that would make our reasonable birthday presents for next month seem inadequate by comparison. The house was immaculate as always, not a single item out of place. Eleanor greeted David with a warm embrace, kissed Lily's cheeks enthusiastically, then gave me a brief hug that barely made contact. "Meredith, you look tired," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "Those hospital hours must be so difficult." "I'm actually well rested," I replied with a practiced smile. "We've implemented a new scheduling system that's working wonderfully." Eleanor's smile tightened slightly. "How nice for you. Richard, darling, take David to see the new landscaping in the back garden while I get Meredith and Lily settled." It was a familiar tactic, separating me from David whenever possible, especially during the first few minutes of any visit, so she could establish her dominance over the household. Richard, as usual, complied without question. After 40 years of marriage to Eleanor, he'd learned that compliance was easier than resistance. In the kitchen, Eleanor handed Lily a beautifully wrapped package. "For my special girl," she cooed. Inside was an elaborate dollhouse, handcrafted, clearly expensive, and absolutely nothing like the science kits and books Lily usually preferred. "What do we say, Lily?" I prompted gently. "Thank you, Grammy," Lily said dutifully, though I could see her enthusiasm was forced. At 5, she was already learning the complicated dance of managing her grandmother's expectations. "You'll love it," Eleanor assured her. "When your mother was a little girl, I'm sure she played with dollhouses too, before she became so focused on her career." The barb was typical Eleanor, sharp but plausibly deniable. I chose not to engage, helping Lily set the dollhouse on a side table instead. Dinner had progressed as usual, Richard discussing business with David, Eleanor monopolizing Lily's attention, and me sitting quietly, counting the minutes until we could politely leave. Then came the announcement that had prompted Eleanor's desperate action. "We have some news," David had said during the main course, reaching for my hand across the table. "Meredith has been offered the position of Chief of Trauma Surgery." Eleanor's fork had paused midway to her mouth. "How demanding that sounds." "It is," I'd acknowledged, unable to keep the pride from my voice. "It's the youngest appointment to the position in the hospital's history." "But what about Lily?" Eleanor had asked, turning to her granddaughter. "Who will take care of you while Mommy is working even more hours?" Before I could respond, David had jumped in. "Actually, I've decided to scale back to part-time so I can be more present at home. We've discussed it, and it makes sense financially and for our family." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's carefully maintained facade had cracked, just for a moment, revealing the fury beneath. Then the mask slid back into place, and she'd smiled tightly. "How modern of you both," Richard surprisingly spoke up. "Sounds sensible to me. The hospital's lucky to have you, Meredith." It was perhaps the most direct compliment he'd ever paid me, and Eleanor's head had snapped toward him with such speed I thought she might strain her neck. "More wine, anyone?" she'd asked, her voice slightly higher than normal. I have a special vintage I've been saving for an occasion. This seems appropriate. When she'd stood to clear the plates before dessert, insisting she didn't need help, I should have been suspicious. When she'd returned with a special bottle of wine to celebrate, I should have been on guard. But it wasn't until I saw her deliberate movement as she set my glass down, her sleeve carefully concealing something passing from her hand into my drink, that I realized just how far she was willing to go. I sat frozen, mind racing. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was I being paranoid as David always insisted? No, the slight smile playing at the corner of Eleanor's mouth confirmed it. She'd done something to my drink and was waiting for me to consume it. My medical training kicked in. What could it be? Something to make me sick? To make me seem drunk or unstable? To ensure I'd be unable to drive home, forcing us to spend the night and subject ourselves to more of her manipulations? Eleanor raised her own glass. To Meredith's success, she said, her eyes never leaving mine, challenge evident in her gaze. David and Richard lifted their glasses in response. I reached for mine still spinning with possibilities. Then, as Eleanor turned briefly to answer a question from Lily about the dollhouse, I made a split-second decision. I swapped my glass with Richard's. It was simple, quick. His glass had been closest to mine, and he hadn't been paying attention, engrossed in something David was saying about quarterly projections. By the time Eleanor looked back, all four adults were holding wine glasses that looked identical. To success, I echoed, lifting Richard's glass, now mine, and taking a small sip. Eleanor's smile widened as she watched me drink, then she took a generous swallow from her own glass, prompting Richard to do the same with what had been my wine. The next 30 minutes unfolded in slow motion. We moved to the living room for dessert, Eleanor's famous tiramisu, which she never shared the recipe for despite my repeated requests. The conversation had shifted to safer topics, Lily's kindergarten achievements, a charity gala Eleanor was organizing, Richard's golf game. I watched Richard carefully, trying not to be obvious. For a while, nothing happened and I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined the whole thing? Then I noticed Richard blinking rapidly, rubbing his temple. I feel rather strange, he murmured, setting down his dessert plate. Eleanor frowned. Strange how, dear? Dizzy, he said, his speech slightly slurred. And my vision is blurry. Eleanor's head snapped toward me, eyes wide with dawning horror. I met her gaze steadily, letting her see that I knew exactly what had happened. The glass intended for me had gone to her husband instead. Richard needs medical attention, I said calmly, standing up. As a doctor, I'd recommend we get him to a hospital immediately. No, Eleanor said too quickly. I'm sure it's just his blood pressure medication. He'll be fine if he lies down. David looked confused. Mom, if Dad's not feeling well, we should listen to Meredith. This isn't normal. I said no. Eleanor's composure had completely crumbled now. Richard just needs rest. But Richard was deteriorating rapidly, his coordination failing as he tried to stand. Something's very wrong, he slurred before his legs gave out. What followed was chaos. David calling an ambulance despite Eleanor's increasingly frantic objections. Me performing a basic neurological assessment on Richard while keeping Lily calm and distracted in another room. Lily, sweetheart, can you be a big helper and go find Grandpa's favorite book on his nightstand? I'd asked, giving her a task to keep her occupied while I checked Richard's pupils and pulse. Daddy said Grandpa's sick, Lily said, her small face creased with worry. That's why we're helping him, I assured her. Doctors are coming to take care of him, just like I take care of people at the hospital. As she scampered off on her mission, I turned back to Richard, whose breathing had become irregular. Eleanor hovered nearby, wringing her hands. What did you put in my drink, Eleanor? I asked quietly, ensuring David was out of earshot as he spoke with the 911 dispatcher. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but her trembling hands betrayed her. "Richard needs proper medical care," I insisted. "Whatever you used, the doctors need to know. This could be serious." Fear flickered across her face, not for her husband's well-being, I realized, but for the consequences of her actions. "It was just a sleeping pill," she finally admitted. "Just to make you drowsy. It wasn't supposed to be like this." The ambulance arrived 7 agonizing minutes later. The paramedics were efficient, loading Richard onto a stretcher while asking brief, targeted questions about his symptoms and medical history. "Has he taken any medications today?" one asked. Before Eleanor could speak, I interjected. "His regular blood pressure medication this morning, and he may have ingested a sedative unintentionally with dinner." The paramedic's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, adjusting the treatment approach accordingly. In the emergency room, I pulled the attending physician aside. "I have reason to believe my father-in-law was given some kind of sedative without his knowledge," I said quietly. "You should run a comprehensive tox screen." The doctor looked startled but nodded. "Any idea what substance we might be looking for?" "No, but I suspect it was intended to be fast-acting and disorienting. Possibly a benzodiazepine." 3 hours later, the results confirmed my suspicions. Rohypnol, a classic date rape drug, was found in Richard's system. The hospital was required to report this to the police, who arrived shortly after to take statements. Eleanor had been eerily silent in the waiting room, her face ashen. When the police asked to speak with each of us privately, her composure finally shattered completely. "It was a mistake," she blurted out before they'd even begun questioning. "I never meant for Richard to take it." The officer's pen paused over his notepad. "Ma'am, are you saying you deliberately drugged someone tonight?" The silence in that sterile hospital conference room was profound. David stared at his mother, comprehension and horror dawning on his face. "Mom? What did you do?" Eleanor's carefully constructed world collapsed in that moment. Through tears, she admitted everything. How she'd obtained sleeping pills from her friend in the neighborhood, ground them up, and planned to put them in my wine, just enough to make me indisposed for the evening, unable to drive home, creating a scene that would embarrass me professionally when word got out. She hadn't anticipated the glass swap or the severity of Richard's reaction to the drug. "She's never been right for you," she sobbed to David. "She's taking you away from everything, your career, your family traditions. Now she'll take Lily away from her heritage too." David's face had hardened in a way I'd never seen before. "No, Mom. You're the one who's taking our family away. With your own actions." The officer closed his notebook. "Mrs. Chun, we'll need you to come to the station to provide a formal statement." Am I being arrested?" Eleanor whispered, suddenly looking every one of her 65 years. "That depends on whether your husband wishes to press charges," the officer replied. All eyes turned to Richard, who had recovered enough to sit upright in his hospital bed, though his complexion remained ashen. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice barely audible. The weeks that followed were a blur of police statements, hospital visits for Richard, who recovered fully, physically at least, and painful family discussions. David was devastated, torn between loyalty to his mother and horror at what she'd done. Eleanor avoided criminal charges only because Richard refused to press them, but the family would never be the same. "I've been married to your mother for 40 years. Richard told David during a particularly difficult conversation in our living room, 3 weeks after the incident. "I've overlooked a lot of controlling behavior, a lot of manipulation. But this crossed a line I can't come back from." "She needs help, Dad," David said quietly. "Professional help." Richard nodded wearily. "Yes, she does. But I can't be the one to make her get it anymore. I filed for separation. The news of the separation rocked what remained of the Chen family's social circle. Eleanor's carefully cultivated image as the perfect wife, mother, and grandmother crumbled overnight. She moved into a condo across town, her carefully curated social life in tatters as rumors spread through their tight-knit community. For David, the revelation of his mother's true nature was nothing short of traumatic. "How could I have been so blind?" he asked me repeatedly in the days and weeks that followed. "All those years when you tried to tell me what was happening, I dismissed you. I made you doubt yourself. You wanted to believe the best about your mother," I told him. "That's not a character flaw, David." "No, but refusing to see what was right in front of me? That is. I betrayed you by not believing you, Meredith. It was a painful reckoning, but a necessary one." For the first time in our marriage, David was seeing his mother's behavior without the filter of filial devotion. The patterns were suddenly obvious to him, the manipulation, the subtle undermining, the constant competition for control. Lily, meanwhile, was confused by her grandmother's sudden absence. "Why doesn't Grammy visit anymore?" she asked one evening as I tucked her into bed. I prepared for this question, consulting with a child psychologist about the best approach. "Grammy made a mistake," I explained gently. "A big one that made Grandpa and Daddy very sad. She needs some time to think about what she did and learn to make better choices. Like when I pulled Zoe's hair in school and had to sit in timeout? Something like that," I said, smoothing her hair. "But adult mistakes sometimes take longer to fix." 3 months after what we now simply called the incident, David and I sat on our back porch after putting Lily to bed. The evening was warm, crickets chirping in the garden I rarely had time to tend. "I keep wondering if I could have prevented this," he said, staring into his glass of iced tea. "If I'd believed you years ago about how she was treating you." I took his hand. "Your mother's actions were her own choice. You wanted to believe the best about her because that's who you are." "I spoke with Dad today," he continued after a moment. "He's not going back. 40 years of marriage and he's filing for divorce." I nodded unsurprised. Richard had been doing his own reflections since that night, recognizing patterns of control that he'd overlooked or enabled for decades. "He told me something interesting," David said. "Apparently Mom had been pushing him to retire for years, but he kept working because it was his escape. The company was the one place where she couldn't control everything he did." He looked at me with sad eyes. "I don't want that kind of marriage, Meredith. I don't want to need an escape from my own family." "We won't have that," I assured him. "We're partners, remember? That's why I supported your decision to work part-time, just like you're supporting my new position." He nodded slowly. "Do you think we should let Lily see her grandmother?" It was the question we'd been avoiding for weeks. Despite everything, Eleanor was still Lily's grandmother, still David's mother. "I think supervised visits, eventually," I said carefully. "After Eleanor has had some therapy. Lily loves her, and cutting her off completely would just create more pain and confusion." "What about you? After everything she's done, how can you even consider allowing her back into our lives?" I consider this carefully, because holding on to anger hurts us more than it hurts her, and because I believe in redemption, even for Eleanor. But, I added firmly, only with clear boundaries and evidence of real change. A week later, I received an unexpected delivery at the hospital, a handwritten letter from Richard. Inside was a brief note. "Meredith, I should have seen what was happening years ago. Thank you for protecting our family, even when I failed to. Richard." Enclosed with the note was a legal document. Richard had transferred ownership of a vacation property in Cape Cod to David, Lily, and me. It had been in the Chun family for generations, a summer home that Eleanor had always controlled access to, using it as a reward for compliance with her expectations. Now it would be a place where our little family could create new traditions, free from manipulation and control. When I showed the letter to David that evening, he sat in silence for a long moment, tears welling in his eyes. "Dad never stands up to her," he said finally. "Never." "Maybe it took something this extreme for him to find his voice," I suggested. David shook his head. "No, it took someone showing him it was possible. You did that, Mare. You showed us all what courage looks like." Eleanor did eventually get help, intensive therapy that revealed a lifetime of insecurity and fear of abandonment beneath her controlling exterior. 6 months after the incident, she reached out through her therapist, asking if she could send Lily a birthday card. It was a small first step on a very long road to potential reconciliation. Around the same time, I took on my new role as chief of trauma surgery. The morning of my first day, David and Lily surprised me with breakfast in bed and a small gift box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny wine glass. "Too soon?" David asked with a hesitant smile. I laughed, the first real laugh we'd shared about that night. "Just soon enough," I replied, holding out my wrist for him to fasten the bracelet. As I drove to the hospital that morning, I thought about the irony of Eleanor's actions. For years, she had tried to diminish me, to force me into the mold she had created for herself. The self-sacrificing wife and mother whose identity was subsumed by her role in the family. In her final desperate attempt to sabotage my career, she had instead destroyed her own carefully constructed life while inadvertently freeing both her husband and her son from patterns of control they hadn't recognized. I thought of Lily, who would grow up watching her father support her mother's ambitions rather than resent them, who would learn that partnership meant lifting each other up, not competing for dominance, who would never feel she had to choose between family and fulfillment. Sometimes the most toxic people in our lives can become our greatest teachers, showing us exactly what we don't want to become, exactly what relationships shouldn't be. Eleanor had taught me that lesson again and again over 7 years, and now finally everyone else could see it too. As I pulled into my new reserved parking space with Chief of Trauma Surgery freshly painted on the sign, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never silence my instincts again. Never allow someone else's version of my reality to overshadow what I knew to be true. The glass-swapping moment hadn't just saved me from whatever Eleanor had planned that night, it had shattered the illusions that had trapped our entire family for decades. Sometimes protection comes in unexpected forms, even in something as simple as switching drinks at a dinner table when no one is looking. I touched the tiny wine glass charm on my wrist, took a deep breath, and stepped out of my car, ready to start a new chapter, in my career, in my family, and in my understanding of the complicated, sometimes painful truth that not everyone who claims to love you wants to see you succeed. Sometimes the most important glass to raise is the one that finally allows everyone to see clearly.